Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Of all the bands that emerged from the 1990s neo jam band movement, no band's music has been more enduring and influential, and no band's following has been and continues to be as passionate and as rabid as that of Phish. Unlike peers such as Blues Traveler and Dave Matthews Band, Phish didn't have anything remotely like a hit radio single, and MTV largely ignored them. Yet, like the Grateful Dead before them, their success and impact could never be measured by sheer number of records sold. Like the Dead, their concerts were ultra-sensory extravaganzas of virtuosic improvisation that attracted fans from all across the hippie and rock counterculture spectrum, offering a diverse and eclectic range of music for people indulging in any kind of drug of choice. Or no drugs at all. Like with Deadheads, Phish heads transcend generational boundaries, and their shows to this day feature middle-aged fans who remember the glory days of the 1990s, as well as young Gen Z people who are discovering the many riches of Phish's music. Yet, while the Grateful Dead were a touchstone influence on Phish, especially in regard to their nomadic fans following them around on tour and their permission of fans taping and distributing their live shows, there was so much more to the band's musical palette than what drove Jerry Garcia and company. Funk, jazz, Latin music, reggae, hard rock, and electronic dance textures would go on to feature prominently in the band's smorgasbord of styles. Just as importantly, they were pioneers of the internet in the early 1990s in how the early website Phish.net, created and operated by fans, served as a proto-blog for fans to connect with each other, thus cultivating and fostering what would become a massive and legendarily loyal fan base. By the end of the 1990s, no other American band could draw upwards of 80,000 people to a single band multi-night festival. By doing so, the band provided the template for yearly festivals that we see in the US now, such as Coachella, Bonnaroo, and the single-venue Lollapalooza Festival. Music critics, even to this day, have never been enamored with Phish, but we're doing more than just defending them. Yours truly, Curmudgeons, are going the extra mile in proclaiming that this band indeed does have a considerable legacy, as big as, if not even bigger than, some of the bands and artists who inspired them. So, break out your patchouli, light some incense, pop a cap of shrooms, or just light one up as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Phish in defense of a legacy.
So we determined the original idea for this episode wouldn't fly in defense of R. Kelly. No, that just wasn't going to fly. So we went with artists that are much nearer to our hearts, namely Phish. So with that, Arturo, how's everything going in Gwangju, South Korea?
And Phish are not going to prison for like what? How many years does R. Kelly have now tacked on to his sentence?
At least 30.
Jeez.
and he just got convicted of the other stuff in Chicago. So let's see what gets added to it. Yeah, and let's not get into the details, folks. But let's just say that was my least favorite read of the entire year. Okay. Anyway,
Yeah.
let us focus on something much more positive and much more fun,
Right.
namely Vermont's finest import, Phish.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Relevant to guys like us.
Oh, totally
Sure.
relevant. And I like to say that this episode that we're about to embark on, I alluded to it a little bit in our parameter setter for this episode, but this is a really personal episode for us, for the two of us, yours truly, Curmudgeons, because Chris and I were both in college in Syracuse, New York, from 1993 to 1997, and that period came right smack in the middle of Phish's golden period, their golden era, which is basically from the late 1980s until 2000 when they went on hiatus. And it's really, we really have to stress how important Phish was to the soundtrack of our college years. They made up a huge portion of that soundtrack to our college years. Chris had Pearl Jam and Neil Young. Me, I had a little bit of that too, but I also got into hip hop with Public Enemy and A Tribe Called Quest and the Beastie Boys. But Phish was a huge part, and we both got into Phish at the same time. They were blowing up at in exactly that period, and for that 93 to 97 period, they were becoming one of the biggest bands in America. And being in a northeastern college in the early to mid 1990s, it's really hard for listeners who weren't there at that time to understand what a phenomenon Phish were becoming for in this period, 92, 93, all the way into the late 90s. They really were a phenomenon that people that just took people by surprise. No one saw this band of all bands being the like underground cult band of the decade. And being in Syracuse, New York, where a lot of people from the Northeast were not only living there, but going to school there. And Phish were just flowering and they were just taking over. And it really was something back in the 90s to be privy and seeing this culture, the Phish head culture, grow during this time period. And Chris and I were just, you and I were just, swept into it during
Sure.
this
Yeah.
period.
Yeah. We were a couple of impressionable 18-year-old kids that were learning to absorb the vast sort of catalog that
Yeah.
forms this podcast in our mid 40s. A couple of things related to what you said. Hoist by Phish, which we'll talk about, was probably the album that got me out of the post Kurt Cobain suicide funk.
Right.
Because it came out, or Down with Disease at least hit the radio about the same time, or a couple
Yeah.
of weeks later. It was before freshman year ended, and so that was pretty special. And one thing to understand, folks, too, is that Syracuse, New York, was part of that Northeast touring corridor
Yeah.
that really helped the leaders of that jam band scene fine tune their sound and gain their confidence as live bands. For instance, Phish wasn't on the bill, but on the initial 6-date Horde tour in 1992, Syracuse was a stop
Yeah.
along that tour. So the context of being in that city, and that there was a music scene in Syracuse, a little bit of one, but being in that city at that time with that band and a couple of others was pretty special.
Yeah. I didn't see Phish live until several years later, but you saw them at the absolute peak of their
Oh,
superpowers.
absolutely. And we'll talk about a little bit about that, in segment, the first segment dedicated to the band. But yeah, my first show was in July of 1994 in Saratoga, New York, at what they call SPAC, the Saratoga Performing Arts Center. Special experience. So that's what I'll say. You know what else is a special experience?
What?
passing over into the parallel universe.
Oh, nice segue.
Yeah, here we are over on this side of the space-time continuum again. It's over here that we prop up the artists that we think ought to be propped up and celebrated and on those billboards, and getting those millions and millions and millions of streams online. I saw an interview with Ben Gibbard of Death Cab for Cutie this week, where he was not really lamenting, but more or less bitching and being angry about the streaming economy, where Taylor Swift and a couple of those can make much more money based on their counting stats from streaming, and where Death Cab really has to scrap and claw and kind of rely on their quote unquote cult and the road to get there. So on this side, not to say Death Cab for Cutie is still on a pedestal on this side. If you'd have talked to me 20 years ago, yes, not anymore. So anyway, on to the artists that we are propping up in the parallel universe. And within this segment, we cover albums either newly and freshly released or released within the last 10 years. In that latter category, we dive into our parallel vault. So we generally grab from that. So this week, or at least on this episode, Arturo, who you got?
Yes, in a parallel universe where rock music is still a pop cultural mainstream thing, this punk rock band would be huge and they would be the breakout stars of 2022. Who are they? I'll tell you who they are. For almost the past 10 years, Australia has been producing arguably the best rock and roll music on the planet. From Courtney Barnett to Amyl and the Sniffers to sometimes King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, the Aussies have been making rock music that at once harkens back to tradition while also showing the way forward for the overall genre. The latest band to prove this to be true is Queensland, Australia natives, The Chats, and their follow-up to their excellent 2020 debut, High Risk Behavior. Now, that debut album became both a critical and commercial sensation down under, nowhere else really, with their funny, raw, raunchy brand of punk rock, owing more to the hard-nosed, no bullshit 1970s punk sound, more so than Green Day-ish pop punk. The new album, came out this year, the excellently titled Get Fucked, has a nastier, heavier, hardcore punk edge to it. It's as if the boys have graduated from the Damned and the Saints, another great Australian band, to Minor Threat and early Husker Du. A lot of this has to do with the band's change in guitarists. Original guitarist Josh Price has been replaced by Josh Hardy. And not only is the guitar sound thicker and heavier, Hardy is technically a better player and much better suited to providing the shredding solos and alternating subtle textures that this music requires. The singles 61 GTR and Struck by Lightning are turbocharged blasts of punk rock fury, but other brilliant nuggets abound, such as Panic Attack and the brilliantly titled I've Been Drunk in Every Pub in Brisbane. Despite the Chat's dumb, mookish reputation, insightful lyrical themes of social commentary tend to pop up in their records, even in their first one. On Get Fucked, the running theme that emerges is that of the correlation between macho behavior and insecurity. Ticket Inspector explores how low-wage jobs given to undereducated, insecure types tends to bring out a false sense of empowerment and an overall power trip. Emperor of the Beach follows a similar lyrically thematic line with a character study of a white trash, meat-headed thug who carves out his quote-unquote turf in a beach town and threatens anyone who challenges him. To paraphrase Mark Deming in his positive review of the album on allmusic.com, there's a reason this kind of punk rock still exists and hasn't gone away. When it's done with the right kind of energy and the right kind of songwriting, it's unbeatable. It's more punk rock than anything Green Day ever has or was. And that's me saying that, by the way.
Hmm.
The heavier, faster sound of the new material may put off fans of the naive, childish ruckus of their first album, but it really shouldn't. The Chats are quickly evolving into one of the best rock bands on the planet, let alone Australia. And if you don't like the sound of that, then you can all go get fucked.
Nice. Uh, yeah, you pretty much nailed it. This is one of the more surprising listens that I've undertaken in the last several years. Really strong. I mean, I like your description of the first record as childish and naive because it kind of was. It was fun, but songs like the Clap and Dine and Dash.
Yeah.
They basically it was their life on the ground is what are they like 20 years old or something.
Yeah.
Uh, and so there was that. But here is a very pleasantly surprising graduation into a little bit more sophistication, more energy, and the change of guitarists makes a world of difference. And so, mostly the cuteness is gone.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, the best song on here, you mentioned is "I've Been Drunk in Every Pub in Brisbane," but hell, AC/DC could bask in that one with a lot of credibility as well. They've probably been drunk in every pub in all of Australia. So, yeah, the riffs here have more of an anarchic feel. The singing is more unhinged. The singing, the soloing, it's all relentless here. It's my kind of economy, 13 songs, 27 minutes. And it's in a way, it's like one long song, which could be bad, but also very good. Let's segue into what I'm covering this week. So,
yeah, and I would like to say the band you're going into, Built to Spill, one of this podcast's favorite groups. How do they fit into the parallel universe? Easily. In a parallel universe where rock music were still a thing, Built to Spill would be an arena rock institution, the likes of the Foo Fighters, and it would be Doug Marsh in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, not Dave Grohl.
Yeah, well, in a lot of ways, you're right. Doug March is a guitar guitar hero. Literally, what's his name there? Albert Hammond Jr. from the Strokes had an interview where he said that the opening riff and arpeggio to "Going Against Your Mind" from 2006 Universe was one of the best things he had ever heard.
Yeah.
So there you go. So he gets his props from musicians, maybe not so much from buyers. I guess proof in the pudding, and that is that their new record, "When the Wind Forgets Your Name," is being released on Sub Pop. They were on, I believe it was Warner Brothers for 25 years roughly. So this is their first foray into indie. Literally since the masterwork from 1994, There's Nothing Wrong with Love. You mentioned it. This is Both the Spill is kind of the resident house band of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. We both love them. Now, this album, When the Wind Forgets Your Name, it's their first album in 7 years, and it is easily the band's best record since I just mentioned it, 2006's You in Reverse, and it may be better. Certainly tighter. But it may also be better. Not ready to make that declaration. Need a few more listens. But anyway, so to set this up a little bit, there's an interview. KEXP, which is probably the greatest rock station or rock and roll station left in the U.S. out of Seattle. They have these wonderful, they put them on video, but they have these wonderful live and studio performances, and they bring in bands, cool bands, old bands, new bands, and they do like a half-hour segment with an interview by DJ Cheryl Waters. Built to Spill just did one of those a couple months back or just before the release of this record. So I imagine it was probably 5 or 6 weeks ago now. And March in that interview says that this record, again, When the Wind Forgets Your Name, was basically recovered in isolation because of COVID. The drummer and bassist for this record, who we'll talk about here in a bit, they worked in isolation in Brazil. They had toured, they had backed March briefly on some touring in 2019, and I think part of right before COVID in 2020. And so it was tape trading, if you want. They were just kind of, March was doing his thing and feeding those guys for their tracks, and they honed it from there. And so March says that here, and I think you can tell that the isolation of that situation and at what it forced it seeps into this record in both joyful and downtrodden ways. Thematically, and maybe you'll disagree with me, Arturo, but I think this is arguably an exact counter to There's Nothing Wrong with Love, which effectively put BTS on the map 28 years ago. Yeah, these guys have been around for a long time. Then the mid-20s version of Doug March could look to the sky and dream of all the possibilities and the expanse of the universe. He did that figuratively on Car and Reasons, and literally on Big Dipper. So here's a contrast to where he is. So now in his early 50s, it looks like March is looking up there in the sky, and he sees a whole lot of resignation and empty space. He's there as an old man and weathered man, and instead of a bright-eyed kid, because that record was part teenage nostalgia and part here I am in my mid-20s and the world is my oyster. So let's do some lyrical contrast. So Big Dipper. Once when I was a little someone pointed out to me some constellations, but the Big Dipper's all I could see. That brontosaurus must have stood 1,000 miles high. That brontosaurus laying on its side up in the sky. Now, contrast that with words or lyrics from the banging album opener here, Gonna Lose, his best riff in a long time. And that goes, I've come to realize time is all wrong. Answers materialize and then they're gone. They were here, but the ones like that disappear and they don't come back. Jeesh. So you'd think with that evident mood, this would drive a downbeat record. Far, far, far from it. This album is an intense and at times dreamlike romp, featuring March's most purposeful singing and soloing in ages, and some really inspired grooves. I mean, on Tethered Moon, which was the 2015 record that preceded this one, with the exception of Master Blaster Living Zoo, March sounded bored and defeated, and boy did it show. That album is terrible. But now, when you watch that KEXP thing, it's available on YouTube. Go watch it. March he kind of plays to his shoulder shrugging, unassuming persona, and he tells Cheryl Waters that the album, it was what it was, and I needed to get it done. Yeah, and he does that. Well, if this is what it was, March and his collaborators were in quite a good place. March actually allows himself to experiment more than he has in 25 years. Talking, of course, there about 1997's remarkable prog rock-inspired masterwork, Perfect From Now On, which I actually still listen to once a month in my car. Oh, wow. Now, maybe that newfound or rediscovered experimentation comes from his status as the only guitarist in the band now. There's no more accompanying wackiness from the brilliant coupling of Jim Roth and Brett Netson. And so March is kind of on his own here. I mean, literally, there's three. I think for the first time ever, there's only 3 musicians on a Built to Spill record. And if there was only 3, you'd have to go back like 30 years to find that. And so, but being on his own, you get this kind of freedom. And so March, at times, he drowns his vocals. Actually, all throughout the record, he drowns his vocals and occasionally in his guitar parts in a cool but weird, warbling, psychedelic echo. It's pretty unique. And this lends itself well to both his more traditional Dinosaur Jr. approaching rockers, like the tremendous Spiderweb, which is a reverently late 80s style stomp rock nugget with March's best lead lines and soloing in ages. The guitar work on that song is remarkable. And that echo especially lifts the more elongated trips through the Looking Glass. Concerning the latter there, Doug is a well-known fan of reggae, something he's only offered hints of in the past, such as on Time Trap from Keep It Like a Secret and Conventional Wisdom from You in Reverse. But here, with the song Rock Steady, he goes full-blown dub reggae, even naming the song Rock Steady, which is actually a genre within dub reggae, a subgenre of dub reggae. And this is actually a wonderful thing. Syncopated drum beats, rhythm guitar, exotic acid-wash percussion, and some fun, spooky organ mixed in. Great song. As it turns out, March can't really take full credit for his re-embrace of the weird and for those vocal effects. I mentioned that rhythm section earlier, these two guys from Brazil. I've seen a bunch of lazy reviews of this record so far. The best of these, by the way, is from Stereo Gum. That's a solid one, but still it commits the sin of presenting it as, hey, it's Doug March working with a couple of random dudes from Brazil. Well, now those guys, bassist João Casas and drummer and fantastic songwriter arranger Lei Almeida, and to all you Brazilian listeners, if I mispronounced that, my bad. These guys are members of a marvelously strange little band called Orulha. I believe I pronounced that right. Orulha, O-R-U-A. Go find them. They're on all the streaming services plus YouTube. That band, it demonstrates the influences. It's a very strange mix of acid jazz, think like Jaco Pastorius, classic rock, and Built to Spill. You got to check out this band's albums. They're pretty wild. And hey, that vocal style, the whole washed in the reverb and vocals thing, that makes it hard occasionally to decipher words. That comes from Orulha, and that's a Lei Almeida thing. And so March is clearly influenced by that. And I think even some of the touches, like the song Elements, has some Brazilian touches to it. And even touches throughout the record, like chimes and organs and some percussive stuff. That really comes from Lei Almeida. That guy's he's not a guitar hero, but he's pretty damn good. So thus, it is very, very nice to hear Doug March sound absolutely inspired again. The guitar hero is finally a guitar hero once more. Definitely check out When the Wind Forgets Its Name, Your Name. Oh, and when you do, be sure to wear headphones. Whoa. What say you, Artie?
I think it's a really good record. I don't think it's better than 2006's You in Reverse, but it's definitely, the songs aren't quite as individually great, but it is a tighter record. It's really tight, really concise.
Oh, yeah. 9 songs, 45 minutes. Yep.
I think the music critics kind of like overplayed the psychedelic Brazilian sunshine pop angle on the record. There's only one track where that really is prominent, and that's in the song Elements. And of course, Rocksteady is very much a reggae tribute. But aside from that, this is very much a Built to Spill record. It's really, I see it as Doug March kind of going back to what Built to Spill is supposed to be. The previous album he did in 2015, it was him trying to do really crappy contemporary indie pop, and it really didn't suit him well. But this album was much better. It's different enough because it has slight psychedelia. It's not overwhelmingly psychedelic.
Yeah, it ain't Captain Beefheart.
Yeah, and it's not Perfect From Now On. That's a psychedelic record.
We're not the only ones in podcast land working hard to defend the legacy of Phish. It turns out people quite close to the band are dropping knowledge and talking about their history and legendary output too. Lyricist Tom Marshall co-produces and hosts Undermine, which just kicked off its 4th season this week. Much like your Curmudgeon Rock Report, find Undermine where you find all of the other podcasts. This season has a pretty cool hook. Marshall and guest hosts will revisit 25 great Phish concerts from the 1990s, all of which they promise will lead to a detailed series of further episodes analyzing Phish's fall 1997 tour. They refer to that tour as, quote, the tour that changed everything. Given Phish's progression as a band during that era, supplying that tour with such a title is perhaps not all that hyperbolic. We definitely are excited to check it out, and you should be too. Again, that's Undermine, with an E, and Tom Marshall manning the proceedings. Cool.
Okay, so before we go into actually, a big part of our defense of Phish's legacy, defending their legacy, as we do with a lot of our defenses, we start off with myths. Okay, 5 basic myths about Phish, and we're going to debunk them. And we're going to do so vigorously and correctly.
Yes, we are,
Okay.
for
Okay.
sure.
All right. So, myth number 1 about Phish that we're going to debunk, that they were virtuoso musicians but shitty songwriters. Now, while their early records were full of rhythmically complex, jazz infused music with ambitious chord structures that owed a lot to 1970s British progressive rock, they loosened up as they evolved, and it didn't take them long to do so. By their third album, A Picture of Nectar, in 1992, as we'll delve into later, they were already writing conventional sounding rock songs with strong elements of funk and swinging Latin music. By Rift in 1993, they were writing short, concise songs with thematically coherent and mature lyrics. And they were great songs as well. By 1994's Hoist, an album that will forever go down as one of the all time top 10 how the fuck was this album not a smash success albums.
Yeah.
They had become genuinely great songwriters, particularly sticking out among their 1990s jam band peers, many of whom wish they could write songs with the hooks and the melodic grace of Phish. Chris?
Well, and you got to remember, I mean, this myth gets debunked right off the bat. The first song on Junta from
Yeah,
1988 is Fee,
yeah,
which is actually a pretty conventional, pretty good melodic,
yeah,
condensed, concise, relatively speaking, song.
yeah.
About the only concise thing on that record. And then actually Fluffhead, which is on disc 2, actually ends, or actually is pretty joyous and tight as well. And so yeah, no, you're right. The evolution was really stunning, and it was kind of up and down up until they got the Hoist. That
Yeah.
Lawn Boy wouldn't call that a songwriter's record. It's my favorite of their records, but not really a songwriter's record. And then you get to A Picture of Nectar, and you get stuff like Stash, which was sophisticated but very, very strong, and especially Chalk Dust Torture, which that riff belongs in the Riff Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And then, like you said, by the time they get to Hoist, you get Down with Disease and Sample in a Jar, which, despite its silly lyrics from Tom Marshall, stay tuned.
Yeah.
Is actually really great. I mean, it's just one of the few instances where the goofball lyrics from those nascent studio days is juxtaposed really with that kind of poppy discipline. And so I've always been a fan. The 2 songs I would point to here, and this is pre-Billy Breeds, which kind of stands on its own platform. It kind of it's a towering figure in this discography or catalog. I am a big fan of Rift's songs, "The Great Divide" and "Fast Enough for You."
Yeah.
Um,
Beautiful ballad. Yeah.
yeah, and the Great Divide is really, really strong. It's clever. It's kind of jazz, and it's not a soaring riff kind of thing. It's almost like a creeping riff,
Mm.
but it's really, really strong. So yes, they had songwriting chops from the very beginning. Even though Anastasio had the ambition, for like 50 other ambitions, they snuck some good stuff in there.
Absolutely. More than snuck in. They pushed
Yeah,
it forward. All
sure
right.
enough.
Myth number 2. They were nothing more than Grateful Dead imitators.
What a bunch of
Yes,
bullshit.
I
Yeah.
know. Yes, the Dead were Phish's primary influence, especially in how Phish built their careers in a DIY manner, starting small in the college circuit and little by little building their enthusiastic following until they were selling out arenas without any radio or video support. Okay. And yes, the sweet tones of Jerry Garcia's guitar were a massive influence on the way Trey Anastasio played. And yes, musically, you can definitely spot the particular mark of the 1970s Dead in Phish's music. But Phish were way, way, way more than that. While the Dead dabbled in funk and jazz, the latter two genres were deeply embedded in Phish's musical DNA since the beginning of their career. The jazz especially pronounced through keyboardist and classically trained Page McConnell. Anastasio himself has always admitted that the British progressive rock of the 1970s, particularly Peter Gabriel era Genesis and Yes, was his primary influence as a young musician. And you can hear it in Phish's early records.
Oh yeah.
It's a credit to them that at their best, Phish made those influences listenable and yes, even danceable. The complex musical arrangements and wacky, zany humor of Frank Zappa were also big milestones for the band, albeit without Zappa's cynicism and blatantly offensive toilet humor. Jerry Garcia wasn't the only guitarist to influence Anastasio, as the lush, emotional, and evocative tones of Santana were always noticeable, as was Santana's Latin jazz rock hybrid infusion that, as a group, Phish would routinely turn back to. Chris?
Yeah, that's a great call. Actually, when I hear "stash" in my head, that's very very Santana, especially the outro. That's very Santana. Another one that I've always, and maybe I've never heard Anastasio talk about it, but he also evokes early Dire Straits, Mark Knopfler. That kind of dexterity. This whole Dead thing. Yes, I mean that comes from the similarities in the whole culture and live thing. But yeah, musically, do they touch on the Dead? Sure. You got to remember when, and we mentioned this last episode, when the Dead had their 50th anniversary show in Chicago a few years back. Anastasio played Jerry Garcia and was able to capture Garcia's guitar tones, which is kind of amazing. But let's go from there. The Grateful Dead never did anything quite like Reba, for sure, from Lawn Boy, which is one of their more fun, jammy songs. That goes from funk to almost, like you said, almost like a space rock kind of. It's still kind of funky, still tight, but kind of like kind of mellowish, sort of marijuana inspired jam. And so, this between the sense of humor and those touches that from that same album, Split Open and Melt. Dead, maybe Shakedown Street, but not really. So they had other things that the Dead couldn't really approach. Page McConnell is really the main differentiator there.
Sure.
Because of his, like you said, he's classically trained pianist, and a lot of those early songs in those first 4 or 5 records feature really fun winding. They usually last about 90-second piano solos. Kind of in the spirit of the Allman Brothers, where there were, the longer workouts always had an organ solo by Greg Allman.
But McConnell's a way better keyboardist than Greg Allman was.
Well, yeah, no shit. But it's it's like basically from the same playbook. But that's not a playbook that the Dead never really went into that. I mean, they had Pigpen, who was a very much a blues inspired organist, especially on that first record, and then they had Keith Gaccio, who was all over the place. And so, not quite as supple.
Right.
So there was that. And then one last thing, I don't think the Dead, for as drugged out and for as zany as they were, I don't know if they could ever come up with something like Gamehenge.
Oh no, you're going to talk about Gamehenge in a bit, Chris.
We'll talk about Gamehenge. Maybe you should talk about it too, Arturo, because I never fully understood what the hell was going on.
I like your description of it. We'll get to that when we talk about Phish's brief history. All right. Yeah. So myth number 3, their lyrics sucked. Okay. Yes, early on, Phish didn't work too hard on their words. They were too occupied gelling musically and honing their chops as an incomparable live band. Look no further than the track David Bowie from the 1989 album Junta, whose lyrics consist solely of the words David Bowie and UB40, repeated several times.
Yep.
When that kind of simplicity wasn't the case, Trey Anastasio and his lyrical collaborator Tom Marshall, working much in the same way Jerry Garcia did with Robert Hunter, early on dealt in surrealist fantasia, whimsical psychedelic imagery, and stories evoking postmodern fairy tales with occasionally dark undertones. As stated earlier, that changed abruptly with 1993's Rift album, with its resonant story, the whole album, really. It's kind of a concept album of a romantic relationship falling apart. The Anastasio Marshall partnership continued to mature with some beautifully crafted and emotional lyrics that perfectly accompanied the band's maturing songcraft that characterized their 1989 to 2000 peak slash golden period that we'll cover in this episode. Chris?
Yeah, you get a sense, and I think it's probably Tom Marshall's personal maturity.
Yeah.
I get a sense he was obviously, just out of college to now, in his 30s, probably family or whatever, been through a couple of breakups. So I think that's evidence. Although I will say this, Gila Papyrus from A Picture of Nectar features the best use of the words recursive virus in rock and roll history. So at least there's that. But The Great Divide, actually, again, that's a really strong lyric. And there's actually strong lyrics all through Rift. I think that's where you start to get some of that maturity and some of that. I mean, even the title song, has a lot of depth to it. So, simple depth. And so by the time you get to Billy Breeds, which again, I think is their monument. You get lyrics such as the one of the verses from the song "Waste," which coincidentally was one of my friend's first dance songs at his wedding, which is pretty interesting choice. So there's the first verse goes, "Don't want to be an actor pretending on the stage. Don't want to be a writer with my thoughts out on the page. Don't want to be a painter because everyone comes to look. Don't want to be anything where my life's an open book." Yeah, that's a pretty nice distillation of keeping privacy and just settling down, basically. Come waste your time with me. Very sweet.
Right.
So yeah. So I mean, that's like you said. So yes, that myth has about 30% truth, but there's enough to debunk it and make it crumble. So maybe if like you had the word myth, maybe like the second half of the letter M stands.
Yeah.
But the rest of it, no way.
Yeah.
So next.
Myth number 4. They were of their 1990s time. Now, this is the laziest, dumbest criticism anyone can make. Yes, Phish's halcyon days, especially creatively, were in the 1990s. So fucking what? Everything is of its time. Every piece of music that's ever been made by any artist is of its time. What's the implication? That Phish's music hasn't aged well? Yeah, well, tell that to Vampire Weekend, one of America's biggest indie rock bands and avowed Phish heads. Tell that to the New Jersey band Garcia Peoples, one of the most critically acclaimed up-and-coming jam bands that, despite their name, sound decidedly more like Phish than the Grateful Dead. And you know what? Tell that to Built to Spill, who are known for their lengthy improvisational jams on stage. I know, I've seen them 3 times. In any case, aside from their music, the other major aspect of Phish's legacy is what they did for live performance. They not only updated and modernized the notion of hippie jam band audience culture for the end of the 20th century and beyond, most notably with their and their fans' pioneering use of the internet. We'll get more into that later. But they created the template for the American version of multi-night festivals that well-known festivals such as Coachella and Bonnaroo appropriated. After Phish worked the European festival circuit in 1992, they rightfully thought to themselves, why aren't we doing this in America? They shelved that idea until they grew popular enough to exploit it, and that they did, staging one band, Phish being the one band, multi-night festivals that drew upwards of 80,000 people, from the Clifford Ball in 1996 to the Great Went in 1997 to Lemon Wheel in 1998. Phish took the European music festival template and put their own unique spin on it, influencing countless concert promoters in the United States in the process. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of putting them on a continuum, you got that right. They kind of put themselves on a continuum that goes as far back as like the 30s and 40s, if you think about it.
Yeah.
But it's that sort of 60s, 70s sort of classic rock and sort of the early jam and early prog. They basically plugged themselves into that, and like you said, put their own spin on it, modernized it, put in that funk and that jazz, and that cleverness into it. And then if you look at it, like their legacy, we're defending their legacy, carries on in the form of those one band festival shows, and actually carries on to the cult remains. I mean, they just played a smallish festival couple of days in Colorado. And so they're still out there. They did that over Labor Day weekend. And you got to remember too that they early on, and even on Billy Breeze and later years, bluegrass, barbershop quartet, they had a weird thing for barbershop quartet touches. Like
Yeah.
my Sweet One, and there's a couple of those on Hoist as well. So kind of that silly barbershop quartet thing. They like that. So, and we definitely need to mention that if you think that they were of the 90s, BS. All you have to do is go back to Halloween of 1995. I believe the first one was Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah. They had a little mini tradition starting in '94 during on a Halloween show. They would play a musical costume, and they would
Correct.
cover an entire album by an artist in their entirety. Halloween '94, they did the Beatles' White Album,
There you
every
go.
single track.
Yes.
1995, The Who's Quadrophenia, double album, every single track.
And then
90,
Remain in Light.
96, Talking Heads, Remain in Light. And then 1998, in early November, they surprised people in Salt Lake City, Utah, when they did Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, and then about a decade later, they did another one of these, and I think it was Dark Side of the Moon. Funny one about that is that they a couple of ones on their short lists in that period were MGMT's Oracular Spectacular
Yeah,
and Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. That
right.
Trey really wanted to see if he could figure out Kevin Shields' secrets,
Yeah.
and with tuning all the amps, but. Dark Side of the Moon won, or
Yep.
excuse me, the Wall.
No, I
Yeah.
don't think it was The Wall. I think it was in 2009 they did Exile on Main Street by the Rolling
Oh,
Stones.
there you go. Okay,
Yeah.
I knew it was one of those.
Yeah.
So thank you for the real time fact check.
Yes.
But it's the same spirit. So yeah, they really, like you said, the musical costume. They were not Blind Melon.
Right, absolutely. All right. Myth number 5, and the final myth, that their endless live jams were boring. Now, starting at the end of the 1990s, Phish's live jams did get boring. Guitarist and band leader Trey Anastasio's escalating drug addiction and the band's sapping live energy and disenchantment due to their growing fan base's sudden inclusion of aggressive frat boy types and non-music loving druggies led to either long, slow, boring reggae or long, slow, boring funk jams. Either way, long, slow, and boring. And this pattern continued, with some exceptions, until their first hiatus in 2000 and their breakup in 2004. I can personally attest to this after seeing Phish in Long Island in 1999. It completely put me off Phish for a long time after that. However, from the solidification of the band's core 4 lineup in the mid 1980s until about 1997, Phish were an incendiary live act and a verifiable force of nature on stage. In fact, what separated Phish from the Grateful Dead in the early 1990s, when Phish started to become prominent, was the sheer energy and visceral power of their live shows. Yeah, kind of like the Dead, but with Rolling Stones swagger, Led Zeppelin forcefulness, bravado from The Who, and an accessible and endearing funkiness borrowed from Talking Heads, admittedly one of Anastasio's favorite bands.
Sure.
The improvisations themselves were anything but slow and boring. The nearly telepathic connection that the members of Phish had amongst themselves, honed from endless hours of practice jam sessions that dwarfed the running time of their live shows, led their improvised jams to have a coherent, almost coordinated and constructed feeling to them, the best of which leading to emotional, cathartic crescendos powered by Anastasio's emotional guitar outbursts, Page McConnell's jazz-based piano flourishes, Mike Gordon's fluid yet lyrical bass lines, and drummer John Fishman's understated way of holding down polyrhythms. Chris?
One thing you should mention is that a huge differentiator was the light show. The lighting at Phish shows were amazing, and also the use of fog and props. They were a pretty good prop band too, so that that their shows were both awesome and at times silly. I actually, since you only saw them once in 1999, I saw them at least a half a dozen times. It's either 6 or 7 times. The first one being in July of 1994 at the Saratoga Performing Arts Center in Saratoga, New York. One of the best shows I've ever seen. It was a tremendous experience. Like you said, visceral. It was powerful, just seeing it and hearing it for the first time. I remember they did one workout, and I want to say it was David Bowie, and it went on for 20 or 25 minutes. But they had a gimmick for a while where bassist Mike Gordon and Anastasio would play while they were bouncing on trampolines, little trampolines. The techies would come in, slip them, and then they would do that. And in that one, they had fog so that you saw silhouettes of them doing that while they're jamming and not missing a note. They have an underappreciated athleticism too. Those guys were in shape, especially Mike Gordon. That guy was jacked. So you have to remember, it's the show that really matters in some respects. And then, the music and the adventuresomeness of or if that's a word, their adventuresome live, or the jamming and the soloing and the right turns, or the unexpected curveballs. I implore everyone listening to do some homework, whether you're an old head like us or you're a newbie. Go seek out live versions of songs like Harpua and Slave to the Traffic Light and Divided Sky and David Bowie and a number of others, like even a Weeka Paw Groove, which is a Mike Gordon song, has some of this that goes on. So the evidence is there, and like I said, they're still playing. Like First Two is another one that was always awesome live. So there's that, and don't just rely on, and if you go streaming sites or you're reading discographies, don't just rely on their 1995 live album. I think it's 1995, a live one. It's a clever pun, a live one, as opposed to a live one. It doesn't capture the full sensory experience of it. You're only getting a slice. So seek out the true tapes. There's actually a box set that captures 6 out of the 7 sets from the Clifford Ball. That's a good starting point as well. So amazing live band, and it was as much about the show as it was the playing. No, these weren't like stationary guys noodling.
On this episode, Chris and I explored the 1990s golden era of that greatest, or second greatest, of hippie jam bands, Phish. For the next episode, yours truly, Curmudgeons, will move on to a more contemporary band that, while not as big of a cult band as Phish, has in recent years emerged as one of the biggest cult indie rock bands in the US. OCs, formerly known as the OCs. They started out in the late noughties, spearheading the psychedelic neo-garage rock movement that also gave us Ty Segall and King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. But in the last few years, their musical evolution has grown to take on progressive rock, jazz fusion, heavy metal, and hardcore punk. In the process, OCs have become one of America's most critically acclaimed bands with one of the most passionate, rabid cult followings around, all leading up to them selling out Colorado's Red Rocks Amphitheater last year. What is it about this band and their overwhelmingly prolific discography that has true blue rock music fans going wild? Tune in next time to the Curmudgeon Rock Report as we contemplate a curious case of OCs. Now, before we go into Phish's studio albums, and incorporated in our album discussions will be the history, of the band at that time, let's go into a brief history of Phish before their first album. Everything going in up to their debut album Junta in 1989. So this will be a very brief history. I'll do the best I can to make it brief.
There you go.
Burlington, Vermont, 1983. Trey Anastasio, Mike Gordon, John Fishman, and second guitarist Jeff Holdsworth formed at the University of Vermont in Burlington. Played their first show of all covers at one of the campus cafeterias. Band temporarily breaks up after Anastasio is suspended from school for a prank involving sending a severed hand to a friend by airmail.
Nice.
Back in his hometown of Princeton, New Jersey, Anastasio reconnects with old friend, I think high school buddy, Tom Marshall, and together they write a slew of songs that would eventually form the basis of Phish's early material. Band gets back together in fall 1984, settle on the name Phish. Anastasio creates their now timeless logo, and they continue to play all around Vermont. 1985, after a gig in tiny Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, keyboardist Paige McConnell, a Goddard student who set up the show, convinces the band to let him join them. Rhythm guitarist Holdsworth quits in 1986 after becoming a born-again Christian. I guess smoking pot, tripping on mushrooms, and traveling with a Grateful Dead-loving hippie jam band didn't quite jibe with Holdsworth's newfound values.
Well, either that or it jived with it a little too much,
Yeah. 1986, the established core Phish quartet relocate to Goddard College, an experimental school that allows students to set up their own curriculum, and they start to hone their chops and very slowly garner a loving cluster of fans. Also, Burlington luthier, by the way, is a craftsman of string instruments.
Mm-hmm.
Burlington luthier Paul Languedoc designs custom instruments for Anastasio and Gordon and becomes their full-time sound engineer, a huge and very underrated ingredient to the band's sound, and a position Languedoc has to this day, I believe. I could be wrong. 1987, the band relocate to Burlington and become the house band at Nectar's, a downtown restaurant and bar that would be Phish's home base for the next 2 years. During this time, Phish take Anastasio's college thesis project, a 9-song prog rock song cycle called The Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday, and develop a lengthy sci-fi fantasy-based song cycle from it called Gamehenge, parts of which would become staples of their live repertoire for many years. Chris, can you tell us a bit about Gamehenge?
Yeah, Gamehenge is very, very strange. And again, I've never quite understood it fully. But yes, like you said, it's definitely fantasy. And I think it was Anastasio's attempt to capture the magic and the spirit of Gentle Giant and Yes and Genesis, especially Yes. There's a lot of that. But like you said, I think they only played it in its entirety a few times early on, but the one song that endured the most was Wilson,
Yeah.
and which was great. One of their great intros and one of the great sort of their sort of chant openings. But yeah, this was basically what if Spinal Tap was good? Is basically what Gamehenge is, and yeah, it's. I think Trey in a lot of ways. I get the sense that one of his inspirations as a music student or as early was to kind of I'll take like a maligned genre or a maligned idea, and I will make it palatable and I will make it work in a way that impresses non musos. And so I
Mhm.
think that Gamehenge kind of falls into that, and
Yeah.
it's fun. It's jammy. It's obviously challenging. It's twisty bendy, and I mean it's total like pothead comic book goofy kind of stuff. But yeah, we need to track that down. There's a few performances of it. I know that they busted it out a couple of times in 1995, I believe it was one of those mid 90s tours. They actually did that. That was kind of a feature of a couple, and it was one of those things that online where people were all excited. Is this going to be the night? Is this going to be the night? Is this going to be the night? And
Right. Right.
couple of times it was, and so it's kind of like Willy Wonka and the Magic Ticket. Uh, so I imagine that must have been really really exciting. So yeah, that was one of the first indications that band was going to be different
Mm.
but special.
So, moving on to their history. 1988, the band start playing all around the New England area, house parties, clubs, dance clubs, community centers, you name it. Phish play their first shows outside of New England by doing a week-long residence in Colorado. You can actually find bootlegs and recordings of this show on Phish's website. 1989, the band wants to play the famous Paradise Rock Club in Boston. The owners don't want to book them because they're unknown. What does the band do? They rent the club themselves, basically pay to play,
Nice.
and they sell out the venue with a caravan of fans from Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine flocking to the show. It's their breakthrough in the big city touring circuit, and soon enough, shows in New York, Philadelphia, and beyond beckoned. Phish head culture is born. The band hires Chris Kuroda as their lighting director,
Who
a
is still
possession
there, by the way?
who is still definitely there, a position he still has. And you referenced, Chris, those incredible Phish light shows. His
Yeah.
innovative light shows provide a crucial element to the live Phish experience and would only get more impressive as the years go on. By the end of 1989, two key things happen. They have a profile written about them in Relics magazine. What is Relics? Relics was, I think, a magazine devoted to the Grateful Dead, Deadhead culture, and anything hippie jam band related. And the second thing, they self produce and self release their debut album, Junta, distributed via cassette at all their shows. Which leads us to Phish's debut album from 1989, Junta. Now, on this album, Phish's virtuosic collective musicianship is already on display with the band's unique funk jazz hybrid take on 1970s UK prog rock on multi section epics such as You Enjoy Myself, The Divided Sky, and David Bowie, all three of which are to this day considered signature Phish songs. These songs are all natural progressions from Trey Anastasio's complex yet accessible Gamehenge song cycle, which we just discussed. Not normally a band self producing and self releasing an album solely on cassette and selling them at their club shows would elicit the equivalent of nothing. But by 1989, word of mouth about the band's epic live shows had spread throughout the New England region and was starting to infiltrate major East Coast cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Chris?
Yeah, to a point that you've made, there's only like one band I can think of that rode the wave of word of mouth and sort of grassroots pushing, kind of proving yourself and getting people to talk about it. There's only one band I can think of that's comparable, and that's Metallica. In terms of starting from obscurity in clubs, and then the word gets out, and then it goes to the next state, and then the next state, and then soon enough you've got, like you said, you rent out the club and all these people come, and so they're able to do that. And so their organic progression is just extraordinary. An old editor of mine, Richard Gere, Gehr, has written at least one book on Phish and chronicles the sort of the buildup of this culture of Phish and how the phenomenon is pretty much unmatched. Really, if it is matched, it would be like, again, The Dead or Metallica or a band like that. So that's one point to make. So Junta, I want to share a quote from Trey Anastasio that really kind of gets at Phish's motivation and MO and kind of explains how they come out of the gate with this record. So found this, hey, the magic of the internet. Trey says, quote, "I always dreamed of writing in an orchestral context, but when you finish a piece, you want to hear it. So we played everything with Phish." Mm-hmm. So, the idea is it was basically all inclusive. The idea is, okay, so, we want to be orchestral. We want to push ourselves, but let's do it within the limits, or let's do it within the bones or the formula of Phish and play to everybody's strengths. And that's what basically they do on this record. They do come across as a band that cut their teeth in cafeterias and in clubs that only 4 or 5 people heard, because there's a freedom on this record, and that kind of defines it. Like you said, you mentioned the 3 staples: Divided Sky, David Bowie, You Enjoy Myself. Especially You Enjoy Myself. That was the one that translated the best live. As we said too, so they also snuck in some real songs like Fee. And I've always been a fan of David Bowie, by the way. The break on that, I mentioned it last episode when we were talking about From the Mars Hotel by the Dead and Phil Lesh's song Unbroken Chain. About 2 minutes in, 3 minutes in, you can hear Phish being born. And so take that and zoom it into David Bowie, and also Fee in some respects too, which is the album opener, really kind of jazzy, breezy opener. And you get that sense that there is a direct lineage there. Really strong record. And like you said, they distributed on cassettes. It was basically a demo, wasn't it?
It got better after that one, though.
Yep.
In 1990 with Lawn Boy. This is their first album for an actual record label. They recorded this in the studio, and the record label was indie label Absolute A Go-Go. And this album saw the band expand on their early sound with liberal doses of hard funk, as in Bathtub Gin, Frank Zappa-inspired zaniness and oddball jazz funk arrangements, songs like Split Open and Melt, while continuing to produce platforms for classic instrumental jams, songs like Run Like an Antelope. And here they're beginning to delve into sweetly melodic sing-along pop, Bouncing Around the Room, one of their best pop songs. All of these are among Phish's most iconic songs and some of the greatest songs in jam band history, up there with any of the classics by the Grateful Dead or the Allman Brothers Band. The aftermath of this album saw the band, already with their own management and booking agent at this time, tour beyond the East Coast and start to pitch their tent poles in various major cities and college campuses throughout the country. The nationalization of Phish head culture begins here. Overall, I think this is one of the band's 3 best albums. Chris?
Yeah, it's certainly my favorite. It is one of the best. I mean, the material is off the charts. I mean, it's just a really, this is their lightning in a bottle. I mean, it's just everything just kind of hits the way it is. Even My Sweet One, which is kind of the goofy throwaway, is so much fun and so well placed. I mean, it's a very well sequenced record. Again, my personal favorite record. I saw a review. It was kind of farting around looking to see if there were reviews and fan reviews or whatever, and I found one on Barnes and Noble. It's actually their promo copy, and the guy, whoever wrote it at Barnes and Noble, calls it Phish's true statement of purpose, and I certainly agree. This is really where Phish became Phish in all caps. Objectively, it is badly produced, but who cares? The spirit and energy are at a fever pitch, again, throughout the entire sequence. First and best appearance of bluegrass in the Phish catalog, which would, a couple times shows up in Rift, a couple of times, and shows up in Billy Breed's too, but this is their first one. And it combines bluegrass and barbershop quartet. So that's kind of clever. But as I said, we talked about it earlier. They had this funk sensibility. They had this rhythmic sensibility where Anastasio could just like ride those taut waves. And they do it all over the place on this record, and it's consistent and it's varied. Like the jam sections in Reba, much different than the jam sections in Run Like an Antelope. And the cult lives on. Here's an example. If you go to Etsy, which is the artisan sort of consignment store online, you can find a T-shirt that someone did. It's not the album cover, but it's a very clever. It says "Lawn Boy," and like some kid. It's almost like a Norman Rockwell painting of some kid mowing the lawn, but it's clearly a Phish thing. You can buy that for $20 if you want. It's out there. Yeah. So So have a memento for a wonderful record.
Their third album, A Picture of Nectar from 1992, is a major moment. Not just the album itself, but what it entailed and everything going around the band at the time. What's going on? Let me explain. For all you kiddies out there who know very little about the beginnings of the internet, back in 1991, there was such a thing called Usenet.
Yep.
It was for what eventually became America Online chat groups and later internet forums and the blogosphere. And it was basically the chief feature of this newfangled thing called, quote unquote, the internet. Well, Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead were among the first established rock acts to have their own Usenet news groups. Phish, however, were arguably the first of the new generation bands to start their own Usenet news group in 1991. And it was instrumental in the growth of their burgeoning, Deadhead-like army of devoted fans. On the strength of this and their reputation as an awesome live band, A&R representative Sue Drew from Elektra Records was an early champion of Phish and signed them to major label Elektra Records. The first Elektra album that came out in early 92, A Picture of Nectar, was not only a major step forward in national recognition for the band, but also a further expansion of their musical palette. Noticeable Latin music and Caribbean rhythms started to penetrate the band's prog rock, funk, jazz cocktail, such as the epic jam platform Stash and the instrumental The Landlady. The band also showed their ability to rock out confidently with riff-led monster rockers such as Chalk Dust Torture and Tweezer, the latter being one of the all-time great funk rock hybrids, up there with anything Jeff Beck or Edgar Winter ever did. Now, the year 1992 also saw Phish be a festival touring machine, as well as a workhorse band, opening for a variety of big-name artists, thereby expanding their already burgeoning Phish head fan base. They were part of the inaugural Horde Festival, a traveling festival featuring like-minded jam bands that saw Phish play alongside Blues Traveler, Widespread Panic, and the Spin Doctors. Yes, the Spin Doctors.
Yeah, Spin Doctors were actually good up until about 93, and then they went downhill.
Yeah. They did a U.S. tour opening for, of all things, of all bands, Violent Femmes. They did. They also did the European Summer Festival circuit, and shortly after that, they hopped on a brief European tour opening for, of all people, Lou Reed, who,
Wow.
contrary to one might expect, was highly complimentary toward the band. Later, they latched on as opening act for Santana's European tour, and they were so well liked by Carlos Santana, who often invited members of Phish to jam on stage with the Santana band during Santana's set, that they also opened for Santana in the US leg of the tour. All of this within 1992. Chris?
Yeah, amazing year for the band, and actually, that was the breakout of jam band thing. Strange
Yeah.
but true, and we mentioned this during the golden age of the fourth golden age of rock series that we did a couple months back. That Phish was not a quote unquote headliner band
Yeah.
on Horde. There was a grouping of six of those bands. Phish was not one of them, so they were on a significant number of those shows, which I believe at the time was only 12. They had a northern leg and a southern leg, and well, 12, 13, somewhere around there, but they were probably on half of those. So that's just some trivia. It's funny that you mentioned those shows and those tours that they were on. Can you imagine being a band having to follow Phish? Like, imagine Phish opening for you.
Yeah.
Uh, and especially like the Violent Femmes, who are, basically one of those bands that just kind of stand around and, they're like just like potted plants. I can't even imagine. I mean, the only one that, Trey could have said top that to, who actually topped them, was Santana, I
Right.
mean, like, because Santana live is just, I mean, that's another worldly experience too. As far as a picture of Nectar, I think that's really the first time that they capture the energy of the live shows. Junta, obviously is a bedroom recording. Lawn Boy has the music and the soul and that energy, but it doesn't really have that. What would you call it? That kinetic kind of boom. That
Yeah.
that firework. This one does, and straight out of the gate with Tweezer, and through some of the others, like even Stash, like it has that energy. Like, Stash was one of those ones that when you heard live, everybody clapped along at the clap
Yeah.
along
Right.
part.
Right.
But they even capture that energy in the clap along on record. And so I think that's the most impressive thing about it. Like you said, this was kind of their breakout year in the sense of the word of mouth even had gotten to Western and Central New York. My first time I heard of Phish was in 1992, beginning of my senior year. They were good guys, but they were the stoners, the resident stoners in the class. But they went, I think one of them, because they did a swing like 5 dates through New York and Pennsylvania, actually followed them. And so I would hear about this, and I knew they were coming, that they were a phenomenon. That's what you can say. Being on Elektra, obviously, gave them good wind, so to speak. And
Yeah. It got them hooked up with Santana and Lou Reed.
well, yeah, and that's just wild, by the way. Phish and Lou Reed. Well, I guess in terms of attitude, maybe it works, but
In
you know,
Park Puderball, a music journalist, wrote a
sure,
biography of Phish in 2009, and he mentioned on it was a very brief tour, and they opened like 4 or 5 dates for Lou Reed, no more than that, in Europe, not in the States. And they remember there's a scene there where Phish are about to go on stage, and Lou goes out there and tells Trey and the other guys, "All right, boys, go out there and show them where what country rock and roll really came from."
nice.
So yeah,
That's like the ultimate compliment right
yeah.
there, coming from Reed. Yeah, and for what it's worth, Park Puderball was one of the best writers of his generation. I remember his stuff was really kind of influence on me.
For the younger listeners out there who really aren't that familiar with how this was really like, right after grunge, alternative, and indie, this was the next big 1990s rock phenomenon. What it was like, okay, the jam band hierarchy. You had the A team. The A team was basically Phish and Dave Matthews Band, right?
Yeah, in
Then
terms
you
of
had
sales, yeah,
Yeah. Then you had the B team. The B team was basically Blues Traveler and Widespread Panic, right? And then you had the C team. The C team of more mediocre bands like the String Cheese Incident, Mo, and the Gorilla Biscuits. I actually kind of like the Gorilla Biscuits, but
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah, Gorilla Biscuits are fun. And hey, don't hate on Mo too much because what's his name? Al Schneer is from Utica, which is the next town
Right.
over from Syracuse. But
Oh,
go,
okay then.
yeah, hey,
but
Homer. But go ahead.
but anyway, back to the A Team of Phish and Dave Matthews Band. What separated Phish from Dave Matthews Band, other than the fact that they were way better, Dave Matthews Band actually had hits. They had big commercial hits on the radio. They had MTV exposure that allowed them to grow their grassroots following and sell out arenas and big amphitheaters and whatnot. Phish did the same thing, that the same level of commercial success that Dave Matthews had, without any hit singles, with barely any MTV mention. Without any of that, Phish achieved what Dave Matthews Band, and even more so, with those huge multi-night festivals that attracted tens of thousands of people. Imagine if Phish actually had commercial hits and actually had hits on the radio and actually were on MTV. They would have been as big as Pink Floyd, you
Yeah,
know?
I kind of agree with that. And hey, the only the main difference between Fish and Dave Matthews is Dave Matthews was a bona fide rock star. He,
Yeah.
he had the charisma, and he had the the voice, and the stage presence, and also he had the kind of the weird combo of saxophone and violin in the same
Yeah.
band. So
Right.
anyway, so there were like little touches that would be more engaging to a mainstream audience. John Popper, he deserves more credit. He pretty much, without him, we don't talk about the jam band scene, because he was kind of the I don't know if PR agent is too low. He was kind of the kind of like the chief marketing officer, if you will, of the jam band scene.
Yeah.
Because he was such a character, but he was out there saying, "Hey, lots of good stuff going on, and here we have this." And so, Popper being on the B team, yes, they were what, a 2-hit wonder there in '95,
Yeah.
but they faded into the abyss. So,
Right.
had to mention them real quick.
All right. So the next album in the Phish chronology in this golden period of theirs, 1993, Rift. Phish's fourth album sees the band delve into darker, more serious territory with a concept album about a crumbling relationship. The band had hinted at an evolving and maturing and increasingly hooky and catchy songcraft with Lawn Boy and A Picture of Nectar. With Rift, it came into full bloom. The turbocharged epic rocker Maze features one of Trey Anastasio's most blistering guitar solos. Fast Enough for You, which you mentioned, Chris, is a moving, gorgeous ballad. The title track, Rift, opens the album like a galloping horse with breakneck momentum, containing alternative and alternating vocals from Anastasio and keyboardist Paige McConnell that are so effective it makes one wonder why they never went back to that device in the future. And with Phish.net, run and operated by fans, the band become one of the first, if not the first bands to foster their exploding underground popularity by utilizing the exploding popularity of the nascent internet. And by 93, the band and their fish head horde of fans were selling out 2 to 3,000 capacity theaters throughout the country, all without anything resembling a hit single on radio or MTV exposure, something that would become a motif throughout the band's career. Overall, and this happened during the Rift era. Overall, Rift combined their increasingly exquisite songwriting powers with their already excellent musical chops into some of the band's most awe-inspiring and career-defining work. As far as great traditional rock albums of the 1990s go, non-indie grunge alternative division, Rift ranks right up there with anything the Black Crowes or Los Lobos did. Chris?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. There's a surprising sophistication to the production, and yeah, it's obviously it's less jammy and less clever, and sort of the energy. in some spots, like you said, Maze especially, and It's Ice for a while was a concert favorite. This was tasteful. This is
Yeah.
tasteful. This tasteful Phish. That tasteful could be actually that Phish could actually be tasteful. Uh, and so really impressive record. I was big into it. That was Maze, or excuse me, Rift and the song Maze. That's what really got me hooked on the band.
Yeah. Right.
I was drawn in by Hoist, but it was Rift that really made me really excited. And for a couple of years, I guess you could call me a fish head there. So one point about this record, the star of this record really is Paige McConnell. Uh,
Mm.
Two of the better vocal performances in if not the two best in Phish's recorded catalog are on this record. When that's Rift and It's Ice. So he impresses as a singer, and the piano playing all throughout is just exquisite. And the piano solos are just consistently in a couple of songs. I think even on Rift, the piano solos are more impressive than Anastasio's guitar. Um,
Yeah.
Kind of a bold statement, but no, this is definitely Paige McConnell's record.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of their very best, and I think it's really like one of those roots rock underrated records. And it's Phish proving they could, like I said, they could do dark and serious and do it really well. They did a great job with it, and they would come back to this in a couple of records later on down the line.
Arturo and I now both use the same microphone, and what a darn good mic it is. If you've been with us for a while, you might notice we don't sound nearly as crappy or as clueless as we did in our first episode back there in January 2021. We're maturing, man. If you have any inkling to launch your own podcast, we recommend using the Ars Technica 2100X USB. It's a high-quality cardioid mic that helps limit ambient noise and echo, and also gives a richness to your voice that you just won't get from a cheaper model. And its USB attachment allows you to record conveniently using your laptop and software like Zencastr, the excellent program we use to record ourselves natively from Texas and South Korea. It's as close to a super souped up XLR system you can get for about $100. Find this Ars Technica gem on Amazon, or perhaps ask a locally owned music store to send you in a more indie direction. Now, one note before we move on to the next set of Phish albums. Arturo, you mentioned Phish.net. Yes, it was one of the first of those fan affinity sites. Pearl Jams broke out about the same time. I mean, this is 1994. And so I spent a lot of time on the Pearl Jam site. And I remember that was being the fall of 94. So they definitely weren't on the early thing. But that is such a vibrant community. And in case people didn't realize, Phish.net is thriving today. And those of us that kind of pride ourselves as researchers, or, sort of folks that can go find the story, the training, and whether it's researcher, journalist, attorney, English major, you would think that we would want to dig and take pride in finding books and, old articles and, studying geography and do a thesis on the University of Vermont and that kind of stuff. Phish.net is by far the best source for all that shit. Well, pretty much every set list they ever did. There are fan written articles, and there's so much history, and there's a lot of commentary, and it is still the gathering place. And so if you haven't been there in like 25 years, go there. It's still there, and it's still really awesome. And so, yes, they were a pioneer of the internet affinity medium.
Speaking of the internet, 1994, the year the internet blew up, and the year Phish kind of blew up themselves with their album Hoist. This was their most accessible, radio-friendly album to date, and it coincided with the unexpected explosion in their popularity. And the band, during this time, they jumped from theaters to mid-sized arenas, all again without a hit single or video. Yet, despite the seeming drift to the mainstream, The album is criminally underrated and contains some of the band's most enduring songs. Seriously, like I alluded to earlier, if we made a top 10 list of albums that should have been commercially huge, this one would be near the top. How did big rock Candy Mountain arena sing-along songs like Down with the Disease, Julius, and Sample in a Jar not take off on rock radio? How did If I Could, a beautiful duet ballad with Alison Krauss, not become a huge pop hit? Elektra seriously dropped the ball here with their marketing and promotion. Or maybe they just didn't bribe enough radio stations. Who knows? Instead, fucking Dave Matthews and his annoying voice, and for a brief time, sorry, Chris, I'm not a Blues Traveler fan, fat ass Republican voting John Popper and Blues Traveler crossed over to the pop charts instead. What a crock of shit.
Hey,
Nevertheless,
one clarification. I didn't say I was a Blues Traveler fan. I'm a fan of John Popper, the guy and the harmonica player and the promoter and sort of the father of the scene. Blues Traveler, the band, not so much. So I had to put that in.
Yeah. Nevertheless, even if Hoist did not take off commercially, Phish's career certainly did, and they became logical heirs to the Grateful Dead's crown as king of the jam bands. As I said before, 1994 is the year Phish graduated to large outdoor amphitheaters and mid-sized arenas and becoming one of the music industry's least likely success stories. Also, the aftermath of this album and the seemingly endless 2-year tour that followed resulted in a live one, like you mentioned earlier, Chris. The live album from 1995, in my opinion, one of the greatest and most overlooked live albums of all time. What also happened in 1995? Jerry Garcia died from a heart attack at the age of 53, and his death meant all those younger generation Deadheads crossed over the aisle to Phish and became Phish heads, resulting in Phish, the cult of Phish, becoming even bigger. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the fact that Phish's rise and Garcia's demise overlapped is one of those act of God, force majeure things, just have a happy accident.
Right.
In terms of, like you said, inheriting, the Deadheads. Where are we going to go now? Well, that's one of the places that they were able to go. So I first get introduced to Phish by hearing Down with Disease on the radio.
Right.
And they say that's Phish. And I'm like, wait a second, that's Phish? Because in my head, because of the jam band, a buzz that they had, that they were way noodlier than that. But here comes this really focused, really awesome pop song. It's so fun. It's got that bounce to it. It's got a fun lyric and one of Trey's best riffs. And like you said, it's hard to believe that from what I remember, the label actually did make a quote unquote push for Phish. I mean, that's how they got on MTV. That's how they got on the radio. And so this was kind of their introduction for people that weren't apt to work hard and still rely on the radio and still get fed what they're supposed to like. So there was a little bit of that. The fact that it didn't take off, like Down with Disease should have been like a number one modern rock hit for months. So, which is pretty special. And again, this record's kind of forgotten, I mean, when people think about Phish, if they think about albums, they probably think, just in my opinion, Billy Breathes first, then the live record, then Lawn Boy, and then, then the other scattered ones. I mean, this one kind of gets left out of the conversation for whatever strange reason. Besides Down with Disease, I think a lot of people might know Down with Disease, but they probably don't know what album it's from.
Yeah.
But which is the funny part is like 3 or 4. If you were to make a list of their 15 best songs, at least 3 of them are on this record.
Yeah, I know. Totally. Really underrated record.
Yeah, absolutely. And very proficient studio. Like the Axilla jam is like to capture that much energy and that much sound and that much layering, it's kind of like there's a lot going on there. And, with the overdub vocals and, the keyboards and all of that, that's just like, I mean, it makes me think of like Dr. Teeth from the Muppet Show. Yeah, and so that's just wonderful that they again maybe in a way they were kind of like the Dead. Well, not quite as decadently, but kind of like the Dead in their
Right.
Oxomoxoa period,
Right.
where it's like, oh, cool knobs. So yeah, and so no, it's pretty exciting record.
Yeah. All right. The next one in the Phish, in this golden era of Phish, is probably their greatest album,
N-
Billy
n-
Breathes from 1996.
no, probably about it.
Yeah. As we previously discussed in our epic award winning series, The Fourth Golden Age of Rock, in August 1996, Phish put on a one band, 2 night festival called the Clifford Ball and drew 80,000 people to a decommissioned Air Force base in Plattsburgh, New York. The resounding, unexpected success of the festival meant the mainstream music media's eyes were finally on Phish. Also, with the death of Jerry Garcia and the demise of the Grateful Dead, Phish concerts became the destination for hippies, druggies, and anyone seeking the psychedelic experience. Combined with their already massive cult following, Phish were now playing big time arenas, usually reserved for the likes of Bruce Springsteen, REM, and Pearl Jam. All of this led to eager anticipation for Phish's sixth album, Billy Breathes, and that anticipation was rewarded commercially. The album peaked at number 7 on the Billboard album charts, as well as artistically, for it's arguably the band's finest moment on record. With its gorgeous acoustic guitar textures, the lush, dreamlike feel of the album evokes a beauty that they never really returned to. It's also the absolute pinnacle of the band's songcraft with the beautiful ballad Waste, like you alluded to earlier, Chris,
Mm-hmm.
the anthemic riff rocker Free, the sultry, dreamy Billy Breathes, and the soaring epic Prince Caspian. The album's well known producer, Steve Lillywhite, who had previously worked with Susie and the Banshees, U2, Morrissey, and Dave Matthews Band, called Billy Breathes the best stoner album since Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Now, I would not go that far,
I
but
would not either.
it
Yeah.
is a terrific stoner friendly album and like you said, Chris, undoubtedly Phish's studio masterpiece.
Yeah, from the little bit I can remember, and there's a reason I can't remember it. Lawn Boy is better for green test satisfaction. But
Yeah.
anyway, this is actually the sober record. This is the record that you listen to when you're wanting to mellow and sort of even yourself out.
Yeah.
Great record. Really, it sounds gorgeous. They were, I think that with Down with Disease and Hoist, yeah, because that didn't hit the way they wanted, they probably went into there with a chip on their shoulder. They knew that they had their moment. They knew that they were at their apex. And so, like you
Yeah.
said, they did the Clifford Ball that summer. They did the Remain in Light thing in that 96, that fall, the Halloween show, and just a special year. And so I think they knew that this was their best chance to build that legacy with non-Phish heads. And they did it. They really did it. Prince Caspian as an album closer is perfect. That's one of Trey's greatest riffs, probably my favorite riff of his. I mean, that's just a fantastic song. For years, I used Caspian as the root of my password. I don't anymore. So sorry, folks, you got to go identity theft somebody else. But so that shows you what this kind of meant to me, just orally, Aurally, and spiritually. That's what that song meant to me. I think the title track is fantastic because that has some country music, bluegrass, sort of Appalachian influences to it too. Free is a wonderful album opener. Character Zero, I always kind of liked. It's a little dopey, but it's great. I mean, it's great dopey because of the energy of it, and that's kind of pretty much like this is where Tom Marshall kind of grew up, but that was kind of like his last vestige of true goofiness in terms of the rhyme scheme and the sort of the chorus, which is like there must have been a guy named Mulcahy that they either really liked or they really hated. So Yeah, and again, the fact that they were able to recruit Steve Lillywhite shows the kind of respect that they had in the music industry at that point,
Yeah,
and
right,
also that they had arrived at, if not A level budget, at least like B plus A minus budget level,
right,
and
right.
so that's pretty special. So kind of their, I mean, a lot of the critics back then, and I guess it still holds. It's their American Beauty. It's
Yeah,
where
it
they,
is. It really
it's
is.
kind of where they kind of prove themselves as being sort of not just musical wonderkins, but like soulful. It's like, Trey. It wasn't all about the frets,
Yeah,
and the pedals.
yeah,
That he had
yeah.
actually, that the soul was there, and here
Right.
is where they proved it. And like we said, this was the peak, the absolute peak, the Billy Breeds, Clifford Ball, Halloween show trio or triad. And inevitably, when you're at the peak, nowhere to go but down. And
Right.
unfortunately, this is kind of where that starts.
Yeah. And this starts with their seventh album from 1998, The Story of the Ghost. Alas, as you said, Chris, all great streaks come to an end. And Phish hit a bit of a snag with this album. Curiously, the meticulous and careful craft of Billy Breathes, after that, Phish responded with an underwhelming album culled from pieces of improvisational jams in the studio. The result is uneven, uninspired, and frankly, really disappointing. It seemed like the band turned a corner with Billy Breathes, and with the story of the ghost, Phish treaded backwards. Everything that critics of Phish criticized him for, aimless jamming, weak songwriting, shitty vocals, corny lyrics, they were all on display here. Fortunately, the album didn't derail the band's momentum. By this time, enormous multi night festivals drawing tens of thousands of people were a yearly occurrence for the band, as they were now genuinely one of the most popular bands and biggest concert draws in America. Nevertheless, there are some golden nuggets on this album. You have the time signature shifting prog rock epic Gaiuti, which dated back a few years earlier. It wasn't really a new track.
Right. Yeah, that's a fun
Um,
song. Yep.
the delectable pop rock of Water in the Sky, and the polyrhythmic excursion of Limb by Limb. So it's not all crap, but it's kind of mostly crap. Chris?
Yeah, it's about one third okay, real one third good, two thirds crap. I also like Birds of a Feather. I
Yeah.
think that's got an energy to it. But yeah, no. So there's a couple of things about this record, like you said. I think that that's sort of nowhere to how do we top that? Well, they came in and there was probably some burnout starting to happen here.
Yep.
That
Yeah, for sure.
they had been nonstop at it since 1984, 1985, with
Yeah.
very little hiatus. And so I think that starts to show. And then I think it's pretty obvious, and Trey has even said it, that around this time, that's where the freebasing on the bus caught up with him. And
Yeah.
yeah, and he developed multiple addictions to substances. And I think that much like it happened to the Dead in
Hmm.
the sort of the like the post Blues for Allah period, and then again in the end of their run, it definitely had an effect on their output. Uh, and so, less prolific, like you said. This is where they started to recycle some live favorites and stuff that they had been workshopping for years. Uh, and the jams. And I'm going to tell a story in a minute about how bad it had gotten here.
Uh,
Uh, the jams were now insipid and uninspired. They started covering Boogie on Reggae Woman around this time, and great song, great cover. It was fun. The jams to it, no, no. They should have kept it clean and avoided the jams because it was bass driven slop. They kind of relied on, I think Mike Gordon kind of was more the driver of the jams for 98, 99, 2000,
yeah.
which is too bad. Uh, yeah,
stick to bluegrass, Mike.
yeah, exactly. So here's my story. So I can't remember what they call it. I don't even think it had a name at this point. The fourth of those big Air Force or airport air base shows in 1999 was a little north of my hometown, Fulton, New York, about an hour. And there's a little Volney Airport, I believe it's called, little airport, but it was enough to get again 75, 80,000 people. And so I'm working for this outfit called SonicNet at the time, which I think had just been bought by MTV. And I had been bugging their Phish's publicists for an interview with the band because I thought that was important at that point, and just to see where they're at and what's next, and just sort of price of success kind of thing. And they kept kicking it down the road to the point where I think they got annoyed with me. So anyway, so I was supposed to go up there, and I'll try to keep this relatively short. So I was going to go up there. I thought I was going to get an interview with at least Anastasio and Gordon. And you get the pass into the show. Okay, so getting up there is a disaster because at that point I'm going to bus to Syracuse and borrow my father's car. Bus breaks down. And driver must have been like 23, 24. And so he's bitching until we get for about an hour, like nonstop, and until we get another bus. That was the hottest goddamn month of my life. It must have been, if it was 99 outside, it was 110 in the bus. Get to Syracuse finally at like 12:30 in the morning. Wake up the next morning. Turns out that my dad, my father, and my stepmother are in a protracted fight. Won't divulge details, but they're in a nasty way at that point. So, great. I come right into this. Borrow dad's car. Drive up to the airport, go to check in. Now, remember, it's about 100 degrees and you're on an airbase, or you're on an airport strip, which means it's like 115 down there, right? Go to check in. I check in, find out I'm not getting the interview. Go back to the car, lock the keys in the car. And so I'm reporting this, and they keep telling me that, obviously it's a show. We'll get security out there as soon as we can to jimmy your car. And so I'm out there. I don't want to go anywhere. I'm a dumb 23-year-old kid at the time. Well, this goes on for 3 hours in the scorching heat with no cover. I was wearing a hat. Didn't work so well. I was wearing like a fisherman's hat. Didn't work as well as it should have. Had no water. And the way I finally got in the car was that these two members of their crew came out to basically smoke the equivalent of a joint in a paper bag. It was like, I don't know what the hell they were using, but it was like some paper container that was like about 7 inches, 8 inches long, maybe even longer than that. A couple of, stereotypical guys. I finally asked them to see if they can jimmy me. And one of them happened to have like a coat hanger type thing or some sort of jimmy thing on them. And finally get in the car. Well, by this point, I am now dehydrated. I know that now because I'm getting woozy and I'm getting, fuzz in the eyes. Yeah. I'm feeling the heat, all that. I'm supposed to meet up with a couple of friends of mine too. And at one point, I have to take a really, really bad piss, and I can't find a bathroom. And so I bought a bottle of water, drank a little bit of the water, emptied it out, pissed in the bottle.
Oh, God.
And the piss was like orange Gatorade. And so, and I'm only mentioning this because, Brian Hyatt of Rolling Stone will appreciate this, because the next weekend I covered Woodstock 99. Oh, that was a great month. But I did that. I finally found my buddies. Now, at this point, they were starting to attract. I mean, the drugs, like any scene, the drugs were actually probably starting to change. And so, and it was too hot, and 15-year-old tweakers, and a thing out in the tent. So it went from being sort of this organic community to now like 15-year-old tweakers shooting off fireworks, one of which went right into the side of my friend Stu's tent. We're lucky it didn't burn up. And so get through it. It's not a good show. It's 6 sets. Great version of Gaiute. That was the highlight on the second day. I get home. I write the article. It was a good article. And, by the end of the show, I didn't give a hoot. And so I just kind of enjoyed the last setup by the soundboard. I just kind of let loose. And, of course, that got back to the publicists. So I got a little bit of flack from the editors. Well, the main gift that came on, that kept on giving. Oh, and I had to drop off the car while my folks were still in an argument. Joy. Is that I had what I now realize was probably a 2nd-degree sunburn on the back of my neck, as in like neon purple, with flaking skin and probably some pustule kind of thing
Oh
going on.
God. Oh.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I creamed it and I think I bandaged it for a couple of days, but then I had to cover Woodstock with this thing unexposed, and like legitimately, like at least Brian and maybe my editor, they were like legitimately concerned. I mean, I worked. Nobody stopped me. I mean, it was chaotic. I mean, I did 17 stories in 4 days, and we were just pumping. And Woodstock '99, was a clusterfuck. Anyway, and so I probably almost died twice. And it was because of Phish's shittiest of those airstrip shows. So there you go.
What we do for rock and roll.
Yeah, absolutely. Top that motherfucker.
Speaking of that, this will segue into our final album of Phish's golden period, and this actually has a positive ring to it.
Thank you.
What we do for rock and roll. On New Year's Eve 1999, to celebrate the millennium, Phish played another one of their massive 2-night festival shows, this time at the big Seminole Indian, we shouldn't say Indian anymore, it's a Native
American.
Whatever, reservation in the Florida Everglades, except this one had a twist. Over 75,000 people got to see the band take the stage at 11:35 p.m. and continue to play almost 8 hours until sunrise on January 1st. It was an astounding feat of endurance, performance stamina, and yes, musical improvisation that not only went down in Phish lore, but is perhaps one of the greatest concert achievements in music history.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And actually, Anastasio at this point, I guess, was back to, from what I understand, I've heard the tapes. He actually played really well.
Yeah, he actually got himself a bit clean and sober for this.
Perhaps.
And it was with this as the backdrop that later in spring 2000, Phish released Farmhouse, and which is, I think, at this point, their 8th album. After the underproduced, meandering mediocrity of The Story of the Ghost, Trey Anastasio took command for the next album. He wrote or co-wrote every song on the album, and while the credits gave him co-production credit with Bryce Goggins, by all accounts, Anastasio commandeered the studio for the recording of the record, making this an Anastasio solo album in all but name. And you know what? The record is better off for it. Farmhouse is not only a successful rebound after the disappointment of The Story of the Ghost, it's one of Phish's most cohesive, consistent, well-produced, clear-sounding albums consisting of several songs that the band had been playing live since the mid-1990s. The title track is an anthemic sing-along that quotes the melody from Bob Marley's No Woman, No Cry. Bug is a rousing stormer of a track with Tom Marshall's lyrics gleefully celebrating his atheism. How about that? Heavy Things is the closest thing Phish ever had to a hit single, hitting number 2 on Billboard's Adult Alternative Tracks chart. And it's easy to see why with its insanely catchy pop rock bounce. This is not Phish's best album, but honestly, it's probably my personal favorite, and without a doubt, their final great studio album. Chris?
Oh yeah, this album pops all the way through. It's not perfect, but it pops, and it's. I think it's like the most, even more than Billy Breathes. It's like right there, immediately, jumping out of the speakers. Like you said, Heavy Thing's a great song. Farmhouse, which they've been playing for years. That's one thing to note, that there's several songs on here that were very well road tested. And so this wasn't a complete go in the studio or go off on your corners and write all new songs kind of album.
Yeah.
It was kind of at that point, maybe they were so burned out. It was like, let's keep going and we'll make a good record, but maybe we'll just put some old stuff in here. I think the end of the record is very strong with Sand and First Tube. First Tube, I think, was one that was a new song. I don't think that they had road tested that one yet. So showed that they could still do it. But, obviously there was a lot more going on than we realized, because you got to remember, at this time, as far as I know, Paige McConnell's living in New York City. Trey is back in Princeton. And I think one of those guys remained in Vermont, and so now they're actually like what happens to a lot of bands like REM. This happened with. Now you have a diaspora that
Yeah.
they're not like four guys against the world, and so
Right.
they're growing up. They're probably burned out, maybe a little sick of each other. You know, like I said, you know, Trey had his personal issues, and so it's kind of fascinating that they put out an album this strong and this marketable
Right.
like less than 6 months before they called it a day, or they
Yeah.
went on hiatus.
Hiatus. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember that reading that it was like October or November of 2000. Neil Strauss wrote a song, or wrote a an article in the New York Times, and it stunned me. I was like, "Are you kidding?" Because like you know, I thought that was like you said, they had come up with the kind of thing where they could go on forever, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden now it's stopping. Another funny, quick personal story. So I wrote a review of this album for MTV.com. You know, in my 20s, I was cool, uh, and so um, this thing got plagiarized word for word by some 22-year-old kid just out of college in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Uh, only reason I found out about it was because there was a guy that worked at SonicNet for me, one of the techie guys who was from Scranton,
Mhm.
and you know was friends. You know, he actually worked at that alt weekly or intern there, and so he caught beat of this. And like, you know, most plagiarizers are at least smart enough to mix it up and have some plausible deniability. This
Mhm.
guy like literally cut and paste word for word and just used my headline or used Billy's headline, you know, and built my editor. And so I just thought that was funny. And like, maybe I should be flattered, but if he had made some effort, I would have let it go. But I wrote a very inspired kind of acidy toned email to the editor, and the guy was like, he was profusely apologetic, you know, and fire. He emails me and he says, "Can you know you send me yours? Send him mine." Comes back on 5 minutes later. Yeah, I just fired him. Yeah, so whatever. So that
Well,
was yeah,
Chris, imitation is the finest form of flattery.
yeah. No, but at least you know, like, come on, at least you know, I mean, gold buttons versus black buttons. You know, mix it up a little bit. You know, so okay. Anyway, I digress. And so
Anyway,
yeah, the end of the road of the classic period for Phish was actually a really weird time in my life. So that's why we said this album or this episode was personal. For me, it's the end that's more personal than the beginning, for sure.
well, let us add a postscript to this golden period of Phish that really ends in 2000. And let me add what really should be added and should be said about what happened to the band afterward. So, like we said, and like you alluded to, Chris, the band continued touring until October 2000 before going on an indefinite hiatus. And they sure needed it. They had
Mm-hmm.
been going hard with recording and touring nonstop since the late 1980s. And by the end of the 1990s, as mentioned earlier, their live shows started to suffer. Whether it was overall fatigue, the band members getting sick of each other, or Trey Anastasio's worsening drug addiction, the band's onstage performances were becoming lethargic and predictable, something no one would have ever accused Phish of being earlier in the decade.
Yeah, and the crowd was becoming actually kind of dangerous.
Yep.
It wasn't the same crowd.
Exactly. The demographic change in their audience became startling and unfortunate as well. Free spirited, harmless hippies with their pot, mushrooms, LSD, ecstasy, drug cocktail were still in abundance. But like the Grateful Dead before them, a darker element started to permeate fish head culture. You had a combination of macho, aggressive frat boy types and their boozing, and an underworld drug dealer element peddling harder drugs such as heroin, crystal meth, and crack that infiltrated both the parking lots and inside the arenas, making Phish concerts no longer the cuddly, happy go lucky experience they used to be. The band ended their hiatus in late 2002 And while they were still able to string together some strong performances throughout the 2003 tour, the band seemingly broke up for good in 2004 after a horrible performance at their Coventry festival in Vermont. Anastasio's drug issues were really causing problems within the band, and judging from their exceedingly crappy recent couple of albums, 2002's Round Room and 2004's Undermined, they were creatively spent. After being busted for drug possession in 2006, Anastasio spent most of 2007 undergoing drug rehabilitation. Lo and behold, Phish reunited in 2009. While no longer touring at the breakneck pace they used to work under during their 1990s heyday, to this day, with the exception of the year they took off in 2020 due to the COVID 19 pandemic, they still tour on a moderate schedule of roughly 50 shows per year. Now, you out there listening, you may be wondering, why haven't we analyzed any of Phish's post 2000 studio output? There's a reason for that. In yours truly, Curmudgeon's personal opinions, those albums simply suck. I already referred to the albums Round Room and Undermined as being pretty shitty, and frankly, the same could be said for the below subpar quality of 2009's Joy, 2014's Fuego, and 2016's Big Boat. Hey, after all, one of the four curmudgeonly tenets of this podcast is every band has a shelf life and no one is good forever.
Right. And
yeah.
The 2009 record's actually pretty good.
Really? I think
yeah.
it kind of sucks.
All things considered, well, best of the four, I guess not saying much, but they got like one or two, like at least one song in mild rotation that was pretty successful on sort of whatever was left of modern rock radio at the time. So they had that. Most interesting thing anybody did post 2000 in terms of Phish and Phish members, Oysterhead.
Yes.
Got to give a quick shout out to Oysterhead. This is a super group with Anastasio, Les Claypool, the bassist from Primus, and Stuart Copeland from Police. Yes, the Police. Yes, you heard that right. Like the three strangest, like kind of like like wackiest genius players in the same band, and yeah, it was a wacky, madly sort of oddly mad genius kind of record. It was a fun record to like walk around to, and still kind of a fun treadmill record, for sure. And so I encourage folks to go find that record.
I want to put a ribbon on this with some positivity.
Sure.
By the time the 2010s rolled around, Phish had become a legacy act. You go to their shows to experience the carnival-like atmosphere of Phish head culture. Hopefully you'll score some good drugs and listen to a band of virtuoso veterans, hopefully add some new flavor to their old classic songs with improvisational mastery. The key word here, folks, and all our friends out there, is legacy.
Yes.
For a band that started out heavily indebted to their forebears, particularly the Grateful Dead and 1970s prog rock bands like Yes and Genesis, Frank Zappa, Santana, they undoubtedly carved their own place in rock history with their own unique spin on hippie jam band rock. Whether it's on satellite radio or a Spotify playlist, you know a song is by Phish when you hear it. They developed their own distinct sound with a dizzyingly eclectic palette of sounds and genres that incorporated jazz, funk, Latin music, progressive rock, art rock, country, folk, blues, and even traces of electronica in their jams from their Naughties shows. They reinvented the traveling hippie jam band circuit for a new century. They not only revived the notion of the multi-night music festival in America, but they reinvented it and set a template that influenced generations of music fans and concert promoters. It doesn't matter if you dislike Phish's brand of music. They fucking matter. And they made an indelible impact, not just on the music scene, but on American culture as a whole. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame beckons them, or at least it should.
At least it should, yes. And with that, we've come to the end of our latest foray into rock and roll's history and continuing masterful place in the greater universe. The Curmudgeon Rock Report belongs to you. You can find us or send us a message at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. You can also join our Curmudgeonly community on Facebook, facebook.com/curmudgeonly. And yeah, we're back and active on Twitter, so you can find us there and hit us up. And, we have some things percolating. Also, should mention we're going to have a Spotify playlist attached to this episode as well. We'll probably just dump all the albums we talked about in there and let you do some exploring. So
studio tracks, not the 20-minute jam versions
correct,
from the live
correct.
shows.
The studio, fear not. We won't torture you like that. And so that's it, Arturo. What's next up for our 44th episode in the history of the show?
We are going to tackle a slightly more contemporary band. And this band started in the noughties, in the mid to late noughties. And right now, as we speak, they are one of the biggest indie cult bands in America. They're not quite an arena band, but they have a huge online fan base on blogs and social media. They used to be called VOCs. Now they're just called OCs. They came into prominence about a decade ago with that garage psychedelic rock band revival that included Ty Segall and King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. We've talked a lot about those two artists, but we haven't really talked a lot about the OCs or just OCs. And they really deserve an episode to themselves because they have a dense discography that warrants some filtering. And there's some great music in there that explains why they have such a huge, big cult following right now. And that's a band that deserves some consideration. They're modern-ish because their leader, John Dwyer, is actually 2 years older than us. So if you're older than us, you're old.
Yeah, at this point, yeah, you're pretty old. Yeah, tell that to my back; it'll agree.